Take your support to the next level by joining our Patreon. If you love these original Sherlock Holmes videos, your financial backing helps us keep producing them. Plus, you get the amazing perk of listening to most stories before they drop on YouTube. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. A shadow from the steps. London lay pinned beneath a punishing July sun. The usual roar of the city had boiled away into a sluggish drone, punctuated only by the irritable clatter of a cab horse struggling over the hot cobbles. The air, shimmering above the street, tasted of yellow dust, and our modest rooms at Baker Street felt remarkably like the interior of a brick oven. We were still in the early days of our association, long before Holmes's name became a fixture in the daily press and a permanent thorn in the side of Scotland Yard. Our lives, lacking the steady stream of desperate clients that would later define them, swung violently between frantic activity and profound, yawning boredom. Holmes occupied the armchair by the window, a dark silhouette against the glare, torturing the strings of his violin. One of his black moods had swallowed him whole for 2 days. He remained entirely dead to the world, agonizing over some obscure chemical puzzle involving coal tar distillation. The acrid stench of his failed experiments hung heavily in the dead air, battling the heat to make the room thoroughly uninhabitable. He offered no sign of life beyond the occasional discordant screech of his bow, his sharp profile rigid with concentration. I was sweating profusely through a dense medical textbook, attempting to focus on the ravages of cholera, preferring the imagined horrors of a distant jungle to the sweltering reality of our own sitting room. A sudden sharp rap at the door shattered the heavy quiet. It was a jarring, frantic sound, entirely out of place in the sluggish afternoon. Holmes lowered his instrument. His grey eyes were instantly alert, the fog of his chemical musings vanishing in an instant. "A lady, Watson," he murmured, staring intently at his own long, pale fingers instead of the door. Elderly and in desperate straits. The knock is hesitant, suggesting physical frailty, yet she persists. She is terrified, yet resolute enough to venture out in this punishing weather. We must take her seriously. Mrs. Hudson pushed the door open. Her normally cheerful face was flushed and shining with sweat, and she looked thoroughly relieved to deposit our caller and escape the stifling room. The woman she ushered in must have been 70, dressed absurdly for the summer, in a heavy antique gown of stiff bombazine accented with thick black velvet. A heavy lace shawl covered her head and shoulders. She looked like a walking shadow. Her face was deeply lined and ashen, the parchment skin pulled tight over delicate bones. Her hands trembled violently as she gripped a worn leather reticule, and a faint, dry scent of medicinal herbs drifted in with her. "Please, come in, madame," Holmes said, rising quickly and clearing a stack of monographs from the most comfortable chair. "You must be entirely exhausted in this heat. Mrs. Hudson, a pitcher of iced lemon water, if you please, and perhaps leave the door to the landing open to encourage whatever breeze might exist." The old woman sank into the armchair as if her legs had given way. She seemed to shrink into the heavy fabric of her dress. She spoke with a melodious Russian accent, her voice a fragile, reedy thing. "Mr. Holmes, I am Madame Volkoff. I have come because I'm being poisoned from the grave." Holmes's eyebrows hitched upward, a silent communication of amusement directed at me, but his expression remained perfectly attentive when he looked at her. "Take your time, Madame Volkov. Drink a little water first. Tell me the facts as you know them. I assure you, every ghost I have ever encountered has ultimately relied upon very earthly chemistry to achieve its ends." She managed a sip of the water. The rim of the glass rattled violently against her teeth. "This defies nature, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, lowering the glass. "It concerns the Romanovs. The spirits of the Tsar and his beloved family are restless. They are reaching out from the ice of their unmarked graves to reclaim their property, and they are slowly, deliberately poisoning me through my morning tea." I glanced at Holmes, expecting a polite but firm dismissal. The heat often brought out the eccentricities of London's populace, and this sounded like a textbook case of senile dementia. Instead, Holmes leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on her face. "The Romanovs? Tell me about your connection to them. It is a bold spirit indeed that travels from the Urals to Baker Street." "I was a lady-in-waiting to the Empress Alexandra," she explained. A ghost of aristocratic pride straightened her spine. "I served her through the glittering years in St. Petersburg, and I stayed through the dark days of the war. When the revolution tore our world apart and the streets ran red, I escaped. I brought with me a sacred trust, jewels belonging entirely to the imperial family. It is a small cache entrusted to me for safekeeping by the Empress herself, to be returned when Russia finally knew peace and a rightful ruler sat on the throne." Terror widened her clouded eyes, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The spirits know I have them. They demand their return. They haunt my sleep, and if I refuse to surrender the cache, they will kill me." Her story sounded like the tragic delusions of a traumatized mind, fractured by historical catastrophe and old age. She claimed that for 6 unbroken months she had been withering away. Her limbs felt like solid lead, requiring immense effort simply to rise from bed. Her mouth tasted constantly of old copper and dried blood, making food repulsive. Her skin burned with invisible, maddening rashes, and her head pounded relentlessly. She was absolutely certain her morning tea, served to her in the privacy of her bedroom, was laced with an undetectable ethereal poison. She had tried brewing the tea herself with water she fetched from the kitchen. She had changed the suppliers of the tea leaves entirely. She had watched her maid like a hawk. The dreadful symptoms persisted. Strangely, the oppressive sickness only hit her in her own bedroom, right after her morning draught, leaving her incapacitated for hours. "I have no enemies in this country," she pleaded, her voice thinning into a sob. "I live a secluded life. I reside only with my grandson, Alexei. He is a gentle boy, a dedicated scholar of ancient languages. He is my only remaining family. He tends to my needs with absolute devotion." "It must be the spirits, Mr. Holmes. They leave no physical trace. They merely rot me from the inside out." I could practically hear the machinery of Holmes's mind engaging. He was already sorting her physical symptoms from her superstitious terrors. "You believe yourself poisoned, yet the tea shows no tampering, even when you prepare it yourself. You blame the restless shades of a deposed dynasty." "Precisely. You understand my terror." "I understand your symptoms are entirely real and immensely painful," Holmes corrected gently. "I can see the physical toll on your person. However, spirits do not brew toxins. They do not induce rashes or metallic tastes. Give me the mundane details of your existence, madame, and we will find the mortal hand behind your ghost." He drew out the specifics with rapid probing questions. Her exact address in Kensington, the architectural layout of her room, the placement of the furniture, and the precise, unvarying timing of the morning tea. He also pressed her on the jewels, asking about their nature and their bulk. She immediately grew defensive, clutching her reticule tighter. She insisted they were buried deep within the house, and that their location would remain her absolute secret until she drew her final breath. Holmes merely offered a faint, satisfied smile, leaning back in his chair. The game was afoot, the House of Whispers. The afternoon heat was brutal by the time our four-wheeler pulled up in Kensington. The stagnant air inside the cab tasted of hot leather and horse sweat. The address was a modest, terraced house radiating a profound sense of faded gentility. It stood in a row of identical dwellings, but this one seemed to shrink away from the sunlight. The front door's dark green paint was peeling in large strips. The small front garden was a tangle of dry weeds, and the heavy net curtains hung askew behind dusty glass. A young man answered the door before Holmes even had the chance to knock. This was clearly Alexei. He was sharp-featured, bespectacled, and practically vibrated with a frantic, nervous energy. His pale skin suggested a man who rarely ventured out into the sun. He bowed politely, his intelligent dark eyes darting between Holmes and me like trapped birds. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson?" he said, his English crisp and precise. "My grandmother mentioned you might call. I truly hope you can ease her mind, though I fear you are wasting your valuable time. Her health is failing rapidly, and frankly, her grasp on reality is slipping away daily. She speaks to people long dead. These spiritualist terrors are just a tragic product of her advanced age." He sounded solicitous, playing the part of the deeply concerned relative perfectly. I, however, caught a harsh metallic edge beneath his words, a faint, unmistakable thrum of profound impatience and exhaustion. "We shall see what we can do, Mr. Volkov," Holmes replied smoothly, stepping past the young man into the gloomy hallway. The human mind often fixates on the extraordinary when the ordinary becomes unbearable. Please show us to her room, and tell me in exhaustive detail about the morning routine. Who wakes first? Who prepares the tray? The house was stifling inside, far hotter than the street. The air was entirely dead, smelling strongly of old floor wax, boiled cabbage, and a damp, musty decay that seemed to seep from the very wallpaper. Faded, sepia-toned photographs of stern Russian aristocrats lined the narrow staircase, their eyes seeming to follow us in the gloom. Madame Volkov's bedroom was a suffocating trap located at the rear of the first floor. A massive four-poster bed draped in heavy dark velvet curtains dominated the limited space. The fabrics seemed designed to absorb the air and trap the heat. A single tall window was propped open, a mere fraction of an inch against the July heat, offering no relief whatsoever. Beside the bed sat a rickety wooden table bearing a delicate porcelain teacup, an ornate Orthodox icon depicting a severe-looking saint, and a chaotic scattering of empty medicine bottles. Holmes stepped into the room, and his eyes locked immediately onto a small, ornate brass vent set high on the wall, directly above the heavy pillows of the bed. It was choked with years of thick white paint, blending almost seamlessly into the peeling wallpaper. "This is where she takes her tea?" Holmes asked, gesturing toward the small bedside table, though his gaze remained fixed upward on the vent. "Yes, I bring it up myself every single morning between 7 and past," Alexei said, standing rigidly in the doorway. "She insists on it. It is one of the few comforts she has left." Holmes moved about the room with quiet, deliberate purpose. He sniffed the teacup, ran a finger along the inside rim, and checked the latch and hinges of the window. He dropped to his knees to inspect the gap beneath the heavy mahogany wardrobe. Finally, he stopped directly beneath the brass vent. He pulled a powerful magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket and scrutinized the painted grille, his nose mere inches from the wall. With a small glass file and a tiny silver penknife, he delicately scraped a near-invisible layer of fine dust from the very edge of the brushwork. "Where exactly does this shaft lead, Mr. Volkov?" Holmes asked casually, slipping the file into his pocket without looking back. Alexei blinked, hesitating for just a heartbeat, his hands twitching at his sides. "The attic, I believe. It's an old, redundant heating relic from when the house was built. We never use it. The attic is full of nothing but dust and old trunks." He forced a light, dismissive chuckle that didn't quite reach his anxious eyes. Holmes turned to face him, his expression completely blank. "Do you always bring the tea yourself? Is there never a morning where the maid performs the task?" "Always me," Alexei insisted, his chin rising defensively. "I wake very early to study my texts. It is my duty to care for her." Holmes walked over to the old woman, who was watching him with terrified, hopeful eyes. "Madame Volkov, I need you to do something very specific for me tonight. I want you to close your window completely. Latch it shut. Seal the room tight against any outside draft, no matter how small." Alexei lunged forward, his pale face suddenly suffused with angry colour. "Are you mad? It's the middle of July. The heat is unbearable today. You are asking an invalid to sleep in a sealed oven. It is an absolutely necessary condition for an experiment regarding the ambient air and the dispersion of particulate matter," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that brooked no argument whatsoever. He fixed Alexei with a stare so piercing the young man physically took a step back. Alexei snapped his mouth shut, though his chest heaved with suppressed anger. The invisible hand. Back at the sanctuary of Baker Street, Holmes bypassed his armchair entirely and went straight to his chemical laboratory table. He slid the tiny dust scraping onto a glass slide, placed it under his brass microscope, and began adjusting the mirrors to catch the afternoon light, humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. "Spirits are merely the refuge of an untrained, terrified imagination, Watson. The truth is always written in the physical world, if one has the eyes to read it. Look here." He stepped back, gesturing for me to take his place. I leaned over the instrument, squinting through the eyepiece. Amidst the usual, expected domestic detritus of cotton fabric fibres and common street soot, I saw hundreds of tiny, perfectly spherical structures. They looked crystalline, dark, and entirely uniform in their shape and terrifying abundance. Fungus spores, I guessed, drawing on my medical training, remembering the distinct, musty smell of the Kensington staircase. Excellent, Watson. Your time in the medical wards has not entirely abandoned you. Specifically, those are the spores of Aspergillus fumigatus. Holmes crossed the room to his extensive reference library and returned, tapping a detailed botanical illustration on his desk. It's a relatively common environmental mold. In a healthy individual, it passes unnoticed. But in highly concentrated doses, or in an elderly subject with weakened lungs, it causes severe aspergillosis. The symptoms are horrific: chronic hacking cough, profound fatigue, burning skin rashes, neurological distress, and the distinct taste of blood and metallic rot in the mouth. It perfectly, flawlessly mimics her imagined spirit sickness. I stared at the illustration, a cold knot forming in my stomach, despite the stifling heat of the room.
But how is she exposed to such a massive, debilitating dose? The house is old, but it did not appear entirely consumed by damp. The brass vent, Holmes said grimly, packing his pipe with coarse tobacco. It sits directly above her pillows. Imagine a controlled, concentrated puff of these cultivated spores blown down that narrow shaft every single morning, timed perfectly for when she sits up to take her first deep breaths of the day and drink her tea. The tea is a brilliant, cruel red herring. It forces her to focus her paranoia entirely on the drink and her digestive system, while the true poison is utterly invisible in the air she breathes. Alexei. The name left my mouth as a harsh exhale. Precisely. The attic is a perfect staging ground, an isolated room where he can operate undisturbed. He plays the devoted, long-suffering grandson while slowly, methodically murdering her with a hidden bellows mechanism. It's a brilliant, practically untraceable assassination. Her frantic rantings about Romanov ghosts only help his cause, establishing a clear record of madness, making her look entirely insane to any doctor or constable she might ask for help. He wants the jewels, and he is entirely tired of waiting for them. He has sacrificed his youth in that gloomy house, and his patience has expired. Tomorrow morning, before dawn breaks, we spring our trap. Her sealed room will ensure the air is dead still, allowing no cross-breeze to scatter the evidence. Any artificial current will be highly localized and undeniable. I will intercept our young scholar in his attic laboratory. You, my dear Watson, will wait in her room with this." He opened a drawer and handed me a small, heavy glass atomizer filled with a pale liquid. It holds a chemical reagent I formulated myself, highly reactive to fungal chitin. Miss the air beneath the vent just before the tea tray arrives. The invisible weapon will suddenly find itself very much exposed. The unmasking. The sun was barely threatening the eastern horizon, the city still cloaked in a heavy, humid darkness, when our cab arrived back in Kensington. Alexei answered the door in his dressing gown. He looked frantic, his eyes bruised with sleep deprivation, his hands shaking as he held a candlestick. "You are incredibly early," he stammered, blocking the doorway. "My grandmother is still resting." "Urgent structural anomaly regarding the foundation," Holmes barked, shoving past him with shocking force and taking the stairs 2 at a time toward the upper landing. I gave Alexei a hard, uncompromising stare, barring him from following Holmes, and slipped quietly into Madame Volkov's bedroom. The heat inside the sealed room was physically punishing, an almost solid wall of stagnant air. Madame Volkov lay awake, drenched in cold sweat, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and abject fear. She looked frail enough to break.
I pressed a finger to my lips, demanding total silence. I stepped up onto a small stool to reach the brass vent and thoroughly misted the air beneath it, pumping the atomizer until my hand ached. The chemical hung suspended in the oven-like heat, completely unseen to the naked eye. We waited in suffocating, absolute silence. The only sound was the harsh, rattling breath of the old woman. 10 agonizing minutes ticked by. Then the floorboards groaned heavily directly above the ceiling. A faint, rhythmic whirring noise followed, like the breathing of a mechanical beast. Suddenly, the dead air directly over the bed shimmered. A ghostly, iridescent cloud billowed violently downward from the painted vent. The chemical reagent reacted instantly, illuminating thousands of fallen spores. It created a glowing, highly localized snowstorm of deadly shimmering dust cascading right over the old woman's pillow. Madame Volkoff pressed herself hard against the headboard, a silent scream shaping her lips as she stared in absolute horror at the undeniable physical proof of her nightmare. A violent crash shook the ceiling plaster above us, bringing down a shower of white dust. Someone shouted in anger, and heavy boots scuffled frantically across the attic floorboards in a desperate struggle. A minute later, the bedroom door flew open, crashing against the wall. Holmes marched in, his breathing heavy, his grip like iron on Alexi's collar. He threw the young man to the floor. Alexi's hands, his cuffs, and the knees of his trousers were thickly dusted with a fine, brownish-grey powder. "The spirits, madame," Holmes declared, his chest heaving as he shoved Alexei forward, "are nothing more than weaponized Aspergillus fumigatus." He was upstairs, working a concealed, hand-cranked bellows attached to the ventilation shaft, pumping the mould directly into your lungs. A brilliant execution of a thoroughly foul idea. Alexei scrambled to his knees, staring at the glowing cloud of reagent still slowly settling over his grandmother's bedcovers. He began to shake violently, his teeth chattering despite the oppressive heat. The polite, scholarly facade shattered completely, leaving behind only raw, venomous spite. "She wouldn't tell me where they were," he screamed, his voice cracking with sudden ugly desperation, pointing an accusing finger at the old woman. "Years she's kept them hidden. I rot in this dusty tomb. I abandon my own life to care for her, while she hoards a king's ransom for a dead Tsar. I only wanted what was owed to us, what was owed to me." Madame Volkoff didn't even look at the glowing vent. Her tear-filled eyes were locked entirely on her grandson. The profound heartbreak on her face was devastating, a psychological wound infinitely worse than the physical illness he'd subjected her to. "You tried to slowly suffocate your own grandmother for a handful of stones belonging to a dead empire," Holmes told him, the icy contempt in his voice cutting through the stifling heat. "You used devotion as a mask for the cheapest kind of avarice. A jewel and a lesson." Inspector Lestrade arrived an hour later, looking thoroughly rumpled and annoyed at the early summons. He eyed the glowing dust on the bedsheets and the dismantled attic bellows with deep professional suspicion, but he couldn't argue with the overwhelming physical evidence Holmes presented. Alexei didn't fight as the heavy-handed constables cuffed his wrists. The fight had completely drained out of him. He offered one last, miserable, pleading look toward his grandmother, but she turned her face to the wall before they hauled him out into the glaring morning heat. With the threat exposed and the perpetrator removed, a surprising, resilient strength returned to Madame Volkoff. The paralyzing fear of the supernatural had been banished. "You have saved my sanity, Mr. Holmes, and my life," she whispered, her voice steadying. "And the jewels, madame?" Holmes asked gently, wiping soot from his hands with a handkerchief. "They remain a dangerous secret." She walked slowly, leaning heavily on her cane, to the massive mahogany wardrobe. She bypassed the doors and knelt with difficulty. From a brilliantly concealed false bottom incorporated into the decorative baseboard, she withdrew a heavy, velvet-wrapped casket. She placed it on the bed and opened the lid. Inside lay a breathtaking, dazzling collection of diamonds, blood-red rubies and massive emeralds, the glittering cursed remnants of the Romanov dynasty, catching the morning sun and throwing fractured rainbows across the grim room. "They are no longer safe here. They have cost me my only family," she said quietly, closing the lid with a definitive snap. "It is time I surrendered them to a museum. The past must remain in the past." Back at Baker Street, the morning sun was already baking the glass of our windows, promising another relentless day. Holmes stood at the washstand, vigorously scrubbing the last of the fungal residue from his hands with carbolic soap. I poured us both a generous glass of iced water. "A brutal reminder of the depths of human avarice, Holmes," I noted, sinking into my chair. "To slowly, methodically choke the life from your own kin while smiling in their face." Holmes nodded, drying his hands and staring out at the hazy, heat-struck London street below. "The truly dangerous criminals rarely bother with dark alleys and drawn blades, Watson. They do their worst work entirely within the quiet shadows of domestic trust. Madame Volkoff's terrifying ghosts were merely a few ounces of fungal dust, applied with a little mechanical ingenuity. The true horror stemmed entirely from the ordinary, banal depravity of human greed. It is a fine lesson in the absolute perils of overlooking the humble brass vent." He picked up his violin from its case, rested it under his chin, and a slow, beautiful, and profoundly melancholy tune drifted through the stifling room, providing a quiet, mournful end to the tragedy of the old Russian woman. Want to unlock the next story early? Do not forget to check out our Patreon using the link below.